Everyone in the virtual was taught about the terrestrial and its history, yet that never seemed to prepare people for when the SI would abruptly pull them out for questioning. The SI's presence in the virtual had been deliberately reduced to its logistical minimum, such that one might never hear of it outside of their 30-year education period upon entry, or, very occasionally, when notifications of a vote would be delivered and summarily deleted. Over the 2410s though, there was a spike in terrestrial intrusion on account of murder investigations. For reasons unknown, residents of the virtual were subject to a seemingly random spectre of death striking without warning, cause or observation. The biological matter outside would simply die off. It wasn't possible to ascertain what the person was doing at the time of their death, since while some data was recorded, it was impossible to experience it in the same manner of the person in question due to the cerebral idiosyncrasies of virtual events. There were only two ways to progress these cases. One was to randomly ask people if they suspected anything, but this rarely got even a sliver of information. The most suspicious thing the average virtual resident had experienced was the sudden 10-minute warning that they were being pulled into reality. And even if they had something to say, the neural interface used to convert virtual languages into terrestrial ones were always too far behind the current day's developments to get accurate translations. This left the second way forward, to rush the Matryoshka brain to completion and create a virtual with a more reasonable rule set. However, it was taking longer to produce the first layer than the Churasix Dyson Sphere experiment would have suggested due to the resource pull of the ring world. In 2415, it reached a milestone, with the scaffold it was to be built upon joining up into a ring around Kahinis. The ring world was a lower priority project, but the build was being rushed on account of external observation. To the rest of the galaxy, the ring world was the epic project the SI had been buying up resources for, so they needed to keep progressing it at a speed that suggested it was their primary focus. Between mining all the minerals prospector teams could log, and working on a neutron star hyperforge for purification, the east end of the galaxy was being cleared up at speeds beyond anything attempted before. This fact was known, for indeed the Precursors and First League had left all those resources behind. If any civilization was to come after the Sustainability Initiative, they were decreasingly likely to enjoy such an advantage. Unbeknownst to the Council of Peers, this activity only accelerated preparations being made behind the steely Uvazavani borders. In 2421, these preparations birthed a new order and a new destiny for the SI. The Uvazavani awoke. No longer content in their private, supposedly irrational business, they showed their hand in a dramatic fashion. Moons and planetoids across their systems took flight, moving into view of SI hyperscopes peering in through the borders, and unscrambling their hyperlink connections for the Sentry Station to see. In answer to the lunar battle station, the Uvazavani had an arsenal of weaponized stellar bodies, glittering with systems of sophistication that defied assessment. And that was only the start of it. To merely match the galaxy's wild child was nothing worthy of their ancient wisdom. The flagship of their fleet would be not a moon but a planet, the so-called Behemoth Planetcraft. A skeleton of metal encased a world high in the atmosphere, fixed by pillars down to the surface that spread out through the crust like tree roots. On the skeleton was hung an engine half the size of the planet itself, and plenty more smaller thrusters. Its interior was lined with powerful lights, ready to keep the planet alive away from a parent star. This was the ultimate battle station, able to produce energy and munitions with the industries of the planet's surface, and perform whatever repairs and alterations were needed by the labours of the population carried within. Its offensive potential was inscrutable, but by simple physics, the energies that moved planets could well destroy planets. A weapon no more ingenious than a long ram could knock anything out of orbit, push a Dyson sphere into the plasma within, or shatter the frame of a ring world. Had that been the fate of the fragmented ring world of the Precursors? The Uvazavani themselves gave no clues. All communication was ceased with the SI and all other powers. The galactic community naturally went to the Imatharans for help, but they were incredulous, insisting that nothing was wrong. Their definition of wrong was unknown, and when asked about their own secret military projects just waiting to be unleashed, they informed all that it would be impossible for them to tell if such a thing existed, and if it did, it would be impossible to resist. Therefore, for the benefit of their psychological well-being, it was both important and statistically practical to have an optimistic outlook. In other words, they were no help at all. The SI would need to protect their own interests with their own wits. 4 more moons across their realm were identified as suitable weapons platforms. Engineers were set to work evening the odds in the stellar body arms race. The most notable candidate was Io, home of the First League vaults and a useful hollowed-out core full of batteries. It could never be armed to the same standard as whatever the Uvazavani had achieved in their long slumber. But if action could increase survival probabilities by even a fraction, it had to be taken. That this was a matter of survival was not certain though, since diplomatic silence didn't guarantee war. But the build-up of battleships and landing craft on the borders gave off a certain impression. Their hyperlinks were clear to see. No attempt to hide the preparations was being made, despite being within the Uvazavani's power, as demonstrated for all the time up to this point. Knowing this, determining what their strategy might be was impossible, especially considering that they were the last intelligent species that scientists had no good understanding of. Rumour had it they could even influence the minds of both each other and of course lesser beings. The sources of such rumours never seemed to know where they got this idea from. The mild panic all this caused spurred the Ringworld budget to new heights. The Council of Peers was eager to complete their bunker branch of hyperlanes, where if everything went wrong, they could cut themselves off with their Ringworld and Matryoshka brain, one way in and one way out. By 2426, the Council had already started the move from their relatively new nexus to the first completed portions of the ring. From outside, the ring appeared to be a dark, sheen strip of metal, but its interior side was nothing short of paradise. After decades of work harvesting nitrates and silicates from across the galaxy, the surface of a planet had been closely emulated, featuring seas, mountains, and everything in between. A machine-made atmosphere arced over it all, held in place by the gravity-esque force from the gentle rotation of the entire megastructure. The ring was divided up into 4 habitable sections, of which about 2.5 were complete when the first humans climbed through to the surface. It was humans only to begin with, as each of the 4 sections was being optimized for one of the 4 terrestrial engine species. Next to arrive would be the Babaki in Chile Section B, then the Silstak in the geologically splendiferous Section C, and soon to be built was a bumpy array of marshy islands for the Eurasians in Section D. That is not to say there was no considering of other species working within the engine or within the SI, but plans for their paradises were still in the speculative budgets, and at least the ring's exterior had plenty of area for space station quality accommodations of all types. A few did end up living in these quarters over the coming years, where they could look out at the galaxy they were now barely still bound to, and dream of the promised second ring. Despite the panic of the era, things remained quiet across the galaxy. The Uvazavani had packed their borders with unthinkable weapons, and then left it at that. Meanwhile, the terrestrial engine had actually collaborated on a project to protect their interests, creating a large Federation fleet. It was mostly built by the Harmonious administration, using their top-of-the-line shipyards they had assembled to combat the very SI now most in need of their help. The Federation fleet joined the smaller SI conventional space navy close to Prophet's Retreat near the Eastern Rim. This was the Uva Zavani Holy World that MAD strategists were sure would be a priority destination for the zealous warriors. Whether the combined fleet had any chance of stopping such a move was unknown and remained untested. By 2434, there were no fewer than 6 weaponized moons disrupting the gravity of the Kastaba system, the main line from Uva Zavani space into the SI. With their core particle lances focused on the hyperlane exit, even the ancient conquerors of the galaxy took pause. The old adage was proving true: if you want peace, prepare for war. Neither side quite knew what to make of their chances, even with all the algorithmic analysis of the SI and the divine mandate of the Uva Zavani. Thus, the most expensive peace the galaxy had ever seen carried on, racking up the bills ever more. During that furious decade of colossal weapons engineering, the SI's investigations into the virtual had lapsed, and now things were getting worse. The number of inexplicable deaths rose. If there was an explanation somewhere deep in those sensory simulations, extracting it in a readable format was too difficult. The nearest researchers came was a deep sleep therapy that allowed the transfer of some proxy for virtual consciousness into the memory of a terrestrial being, although it only really worked on Bibaki. It was done in secret, as accessing those memories had a strong risk of imprinting them long-term into the subject, which caused a dysphoric delirium for years afterwards. At least it was more material to study. The trials were only able to determine that among those who never left the virtual, something akin to a hive mind was developing. Although it was not one shared mind, only a lack of compartmentalization between a trillion different ones. It could be the beginnings of a hive, but with such crude tools it could not be studied over time. The solution then was to improve the tools, and that was what the Matryoshka brain promised. In the virtual, the SI couldn't see all the private data shooting about. In the new virtual, they would be the ones doing the shooting. The project had progressed slowly during the arms race, but the first layer of star-circling computer was by then complete. It was activated, bringing orders of magnitude more power to bear than the Night Garden computer. That planetary reset of unfathomable effort was rendered obsolete with devastating speed. With the new systems, the design for the new virtual entered practical tests. The testing was very accurate, since the system could simulate its own users in ways only it could predict, and indeed it could even come up with its own solutions to the problems arising. It was not artificial intelligence in a general sense, but it was the closest the SI had dared tread. This new god on a leash was hard to keep under wraps. The elites of all the other powers were well aware of it, and understood the power it was offering. They did not rally against it, despite their fear. A machine to control all aspects of life, it gave the SI absolute power, but only over their own citizens, and to some extent they had the right to conduct their administration in any fashion they wished. But alongside the development of a space fleet to match the Uva Zavani, the SI's control over those outside their remit was growing in the shadows. This was true most of all for the Gorf Assembly, which was dissolved at the close of 2438. The trend of outsourcing their leadership roles to other groups had engendered greater and greater need for custodians. Only the fast-thinking blood creatures of the terrestrial engine could produce an economy to rival the Gorf's neighbours. Without such work, how could the Gorf compete? And so as SI shell organizations took over Gorf concerns, in order to effectively counter the market imperialism of alloy-hungry other SI shells, the economy of the assembly became a game that the SI played with itself. Eventually the creases were ironed out, and the SI's de facto dominance of Gorf life became official. the Department of Greater Gorf Matters was created to preserve the species and organize their contributions of resources to the SI's distant wonders. Literally before they knew it, the Gorf ceased to have a government of their own design. When the severe lack of resources given to the DGGM is taken into account, it could be said that they ceased to have much of a government at all, creating a free haven for the galaxy's outlaws with the perks of SI sustenance guarantees. It was all solvable, but the Council of Peers was focused on not just other places, but other times. They were jumping the gun on the Matryoshka brain by pushing experiments for what would one day replace it. These experiments took place at the Penrose Sphere, hidden in the SI's Imutharan Annex. The Dyson Sphere might have been a powerful machine, but the stars at their heart were a dying breed. The black hole, on the other hand, was theoretically the longest-lived part of reality, save the empty fabric itself. If the SI succeeded in the current era, one day they would have to move their computers and ring worlds to huddle around black holes. This one day was quite far in the future, to put it lightly, but things got started in 2440 all the same. A small ring world had been made around the Penrose Sphere, lit and powered artificially with the yields of scattering radiation inside the sphere's body. The universe had been around some 14 billion years. It was possible that after 14 billion more sets of 14 billion years, terrestrial life as the SI knew it might still exist. So this experimental lifeboat would be the best shot at giving them a home, provided no one thought of anything better in the interim. This one was filled with the enigmatic Andigonj, silent and stoic, and these days kept by all powers of the galaxy as a sort of ornamental demographic on account of their unnatural origin. Now, if the engineers at the Penrose Sphere had got the numbers right, they could sit in their lifeboat until the end of time. It wasn't foolproof. The machine existed physically, which comes with all kinds of dangers, but those were the MAD's job to combat. They, of course, were daily at the ready for news of a spectacular war of moons and planets, and they were daily disappointed. Behind them, the SI was pouring all the matter they could dredge up into the so-called neutronium hyperforge at Firam, a neutron star in the old First League core. The gravity of the star helped speed up purification and forging in the rings wrapped around it, spitting out components and materials to be hypershipped to the Forbidden Nebula. In 2443, the second layer of computers around the star was ready, which would have rendered the first set obsolete were they not to work in tandem. Between them and the SI's million best programmers, the final program had been written. The brain could now simulate the universe, but only in real time. This was no good. For the new virtual, the new everything, time needed to run as fast as possible to make forever as long as it could be. For that, the ships kept dragging in continent after continent of quantum computers, fusing together a machine that could cycle through 200 years a minute. Its residents would be walled off, and if the terrestrial was destroyed a week later, that was still aeons of civilization facilitated in captivity. The mandate of the SI would be fulfilled. To build this epic machine, more materials were needed than the economy could provide. There were only so many accessible ores in the hyperlane network, and only so many one could purchase. But there was another method to get valuable elements: go straight to the source. All those ores were generated originally in stars, and so stars were a great place to manufacture more. In 2449, a new kind of mine was in development, known as a stellar lifter. The Terminus Barban system in the far northeast was the test candidate. It would be host to a machine that toyed with the star's magnetic field, drawing plasma up into harvesters and then fusing its light elements into whatever the SI needed, fueled by the energy the star below radiated. This would gradually kill the star, but they were all going out anyway, and the SI had methods to survive without them, So what was the harm in cutting down the forest to build a wall? With all their equipment and plans, the SI still had centuries of work ahead of them, even after the centuries of achievements thus far. But time was not on their side, and whether this was by their own fault is a matter of debate. It was already known that life existed beyond space-time, in other spaces and times just a hair's breadth away in an unthinkable direction. The SI had been willingly disturbing those waters, rocking the boats of the Uvazavani to life. Now the consequences multiplied. While the deadly attack moons faced off in the east, a bridge appeared in the west. Travelers from those other spaces had come to the fourth dimension. They were familiar with this space and poured in freely and with form, for the realm of the three directions was their hunting ground. Nothing was known or could be known about them other than their flickering, colourful shape, although all shapes were merely cross-sections of their true higher forms. What could be known and measured with certainty were their actions. Without delay, their shimmering, white pastel blobs spread throughout space, destroying ships and stations with unknown, instantaneous weapons, and collecting up the remains. It was as if they were harvesting the galaxy. The SI had a rival.